Welcome to another, hello everyone, welcome to another seminar for the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I am Chelsea Estancona. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. I co-organize this colloquium with Brad Smith at Vanderbilt University, who is an assistant professor as well. And so the online political science colloquium began in 2015. This was designed as a way to extend the reach of the Peace Science Society past the annual meeting, so to bring in a variety of research that was encouraged at the meetings and to try and expand the community itself. So we are here celebrating the excellent research that happens both before and certainly after that annual Peace Science Society meeting. You can find us on Twitter. We have an online Peace Science Colloquium account. We also have a website via Wix site, and we also post these to our YouTube account so that folks can watch them afterwards, and so that our presenters and discussants as needed can go back and view the comments. So we have a fantastic paper today from Konstantin, who is at the University of Central Florida, and it is titled History and Support for Settlement of the Russian Invasion of Ukraine. And today we have one wonderful discussant who is Tolga Sinmazdemir, who is from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. So the basics of how we'll proceed today. So Konstantin will give us a roughly 15-minute presentation. After that, we'll transition over to Tolga's comments. I will try to pay attention to if there is anyone contributing via the audience, especially if those comments pair well with what Tolga is bringing today. I'll also probably have a few questions moving forward. So once Tolga is finished with his comments, we will switch things over and open it up for those to put comments in the chat. Again, I'll monitor those. And hopefully we'll have a great and productive discussion. So I'll go ahead and let Konstantin go ahead and share his screen.
All right, great. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Tolga, Jennifer, for organizing things. Full screen doesn't come on. I just want to do this. There we go. Okay, so thank you guys for having me on. I'll also time myself. And you heard my title. So the general research question here is, how does sort of a collective memory of historical events affect support for settling an armed conflict that's currently ongoing? Now, there haven't been a lot of ongoing international conflicts. So the scope, you're wondering, well, we're talking about countries that have been invaded by another country. Those wars in the last 30 years have been fairly short. So realistically, we're just talking about Ukraine after a 2022 invasion by Russia. But there has been a lot of work in political science, as we'll see in a little bit, done on the effect of history, especially in that particular region, on contemporary politics. So it is something that extends that existing work. So the core claim that I'll get to in more detail in a little bit is that narratives, in particular narratives of fighting against invaders or repression by what are perceived as foreign forces, make people less likely to prefer a peaceful settlement. And I'm sort of neutral on the collective memory with the invading party. I'll clarify that in a little bit. And then the mechanism, well, there'll be two mechanisms I'll be tested. It's having this collective memory, as in a national consciousness. We experience this as a people, this historical event, or having actual family history, as in my grandparents lived through this historical event and remember it and told me about it. That sort of contrast of what these mechanisms could be, and these are also tested. And there is also an alternative mechanism that's going to be tested here, is contemporary public opinion and how that affects preferences, specifically treating on public opinion in some of the regions that have been occupied by the invading power. So yes, history is relevant in Ukraine. These are just pictures I took when I was there last year after the invasion. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army / People's Army pictured above. This is graffitied in Lviv that compares them to the current Ukrainian army, the sort of bridges those current wars. B and C are monuments made. C specifically says genocide 1944. B is a wall of people who were deported to Siberia. There's Zhukov paper about that too. Post-World War II. And then in Chernovtsi, in D, is a monument that includes Holodomor. It's the third sort of cube. 1947-46 is the first cube. It still talks about the post-World War II repression, but the third cube includes Holodomor, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the basic idea is this stuff is still relevant, and you can go to other parts of Ukraine, and these monuments are kind of go back up and down, but there are still World War II monuments as well throughout, and all over the country. And these don't even need to be pictured because they're sort of what are the most notable ones that you see. Okay, so what we already know foremost is about support for peace agreements. There's some debate as to what effect conflict experience has. Some people say it has more of a hardening effect, that people are less likely to settle if they want a settlement, if they've experienced something related to conflict, either they're wounded or their family's wounded, or they live near the front lines, they've lost house, anything like that. On the other hand, other people find the opposite. It kind of depends on the location. At the same time, when this survey was done, specifically, late May to mid-June is when most of the sample was gathered. We have most people, yes, conflict experience to some extent, but the people who were able to leave, I'll talk about the sample a little bit later, there aren't that many people who have had that tangible experience. So we're not going to be talking about those people per se. And at the same time, we do know there is an effect of history in this region. So this Charnish and Pesach talk about specifically Poles that were forced to leave Ukraine after World War II. Rosenhaus and Zhukov talk about the effect of Holodomor on politics after World War II. Lupu and Pesach talk about Crimean Tatars and sort of the collective memory of the deportation of Crimean Tatars from Crimea, and then their sort of public opinion afterwards for those that were able to return. This stuff is there. There's also work by Zhukov on the Siberian, the people who were forced to go to Siberia as part of the repression of the sort of billboards and monuments you just saw. So it is something that is relevant, and it's something that it's worth examining, especially since, as I kind of don't have it on slides, but there's been a propagandistic effect as well in terms of framing the conflict. Well, mostly the Russian side says Ukraine doesn't exist, and it's sort of made up by the Soviet Union, but the Ukrainian side has also talked about some of these episodes of repression historically in the political sphere. So there are 5 pre-registered expectations here. There's actually more than 5. Some of them are completely unrelated and analyzed in other papers. Some of them are stuff I just haven't gotten around to writing up, and it's kind of peripheral to this thing. But 3 are about history, and 3 core historical events that we'll be looking at, and 2 are about contemporary events, and specifically contemporary public opinion. I'll kind of explain what the justification for this is. With the historical events, the 3 historical events are the Ukrainian People's Army fighting against a foreign invader. The Western Ukraine was not a part of the Soviet Union until after World War II. Well, right before the start of World War II, and then the Nazis occupied it, and then the Soviets occupied it again. And then there was an insurgency against the Soviet rule for about the next 10 years or so, give or take, that ultimately was defeated. But the idea is, if you prime on a history of fighting against a foreign invader, people will be less likely to support a peaceful settlement. More likely, sorry for the typo, more likely to want to fight it out. Holodomor, same thing. Holodomor was a famine that was, we'll talk about how controversial it is, but in the narrative, Holodomor is a famine that was orchestrated by Stalin to basically retribution against Ukrainian kulaks, things like that. Whether it was exacerbated by weather or something along those lines, not relevant here. It is what it is in the broader collective memory as this genocide. It's been declared a genocide in various countries. Again, this should decrease peaceful settlement. And then the Red Army, it is sort of a collective push to force Nazi Germany out of Ukraine. And a lot of people have family members who served in the Red Army. But my pre-registered expectation was of no effect, because the kind of use of the propaganda by Russia in particular, at the same time, people still have that memory, and it might be positive. So the family history mechanisms are sort of, the UPA should, if you have family history, you should be even less likely to support a peaceful settlement. With the Red Army, you should also be more likely, because maybe, you know, somebody served in the Red Army and has family who's served in the Red Army in Russia, and you have family who served in the Red Army in Ukraine. Maybe it's something collective that maybe you do want to make more likely to make peace with those people. With Holodomor, this is 2A is a test of the Rose-Nelson-Zhukov mechanism, that the closer you are to repression, or in this case, the closer you are to conflict, the less likely you should be to want the conflict to continue. So that's kind of the test here. So it should increase support if you're proximate to the conflict. And then the contemporary memory hypotheses are that public opinion in Crimea, it's hard to say anything about public opinion in the Donbass, the DNR, and LNR, in particular those separatist regions for 8 years. But a treatment on passportization, basically, this stuff should also increase support, because, you know, those people want to leave, so maybe let's let them go. Okay, mechanisms, I'm going too long. Mechanisms for the survey, it's 1,300 people. I already said when it was surveyed, carried out by a survey firm in Lviv. There were some quotas. It was street sampling, because I couldn't really send the enumerators into people's houses with all the bomb alerts that were going on at the time. It was a Qualtrics online app. I was there. I monitored 69 surveys. And also, I was there to make sure they were doing them right, and also to make sure that the app worked properly. The app sucks. So it did eventually work properly, but sometimes it sucks. Prompts, these two are the main prompts. They're asked after all the treatments are given. Just basically, do we need a peace agreement to end the war, or will the Ukrainian army crush the Russian army? Supplemental concession prompts, these are asked, the first four are asked after the historical treatments, and then the contemporary sort of Donbass passportization treatment is given, and then the contemporary Crimea public opinion treatment is given, and then the main prompts are given. So this is presented, the main prompts are the main outcome variables, but they're actually given last. Things start with neutrality status. And the first four treatments are also basically the demands Russia made of Ukraine before the conflict. So it's like, do you want to give this stuff up? Here's how the treatments were written out. And again, they are written out in the most positive way possible. So there's nothing here about the Ukrainian insurgent army collaborating with the Nazis, as like some other people will say. There's nothing here about maybe Holodomor was related to the weather, maybe it was related to bad agricultural policy, wasn't intentional, something like that. And there's nothing here about, you know, the Red Army, you know, using tactics that are basically throwing people out, much like Russia is doing now. There's nothing about that. Everything is treated as positively, because it's designed to reflect the narratives of either Ukraine or the narratives of Russia in terms of framing these historical events. People get one of these three, or they get nothing. 25, 25, 25, 25. At the end, everybody's asked about family history. So at the end of the survey, these are the last questions if you don't get treated on them. And then the contemporary questions, the treatments, I could not find reliable public opinion data. That was like, O'Loughlin has a survey with Kristen Back and some other people. It depends on who's asking. It depends on which survey firm's asking. There's nothing reliable that says they want to join Russia a priori to the invasion. With the O'Loughlin does have a reliable seeming survey, and it says in the treatment, survey conducted by Western researchers, it's O'Loughlin, 82% of Crimeans support joining Russia. This is before the invasion. And I do that's reliable. That was a 50-50 treatment. Okay, results. For the basic sort of peace agreement results, There is a increase in support for the peace agreement if you get the Crimea treatment. Otherwise, no effects. And with the crushing the Russian army, that was just such a, everybody pretty much agreed with that. So the fact that there are no treatment effects is not super surprising, because I think it's like 87% agreement. I forgot what the exact chart said. With these smaller concessions that are non-territorial, the UPA treatment does decrease support for making Russian the second language, and substantively, it also decreases support in neutrality. So this is from everybody, not just if you have family members. For territorial concessions, the UPA treatment is consistent in decreasing support for independence for both the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. These are the regions, not the actual separatist regions, and also the separatist regions when that treatment is given on passportization. The passportization treatment has no effect. But when the Crimea treatment is given about popularity for joining Russia, that treatment does have a positive effect on ceding Crimea. At the same time, I will note these are not popular. These are, for the most part, most people say strongly disagree when it comes to this stuff. It's just moving the bar a little bit from strongly disagree. But it does have an effect. In terms of family history, there's a conditional effect of family history on peaceful settlement, as in if you have family history with people who served in the Ukrainian insurgent army, those people will be less likely to want to make a peace agreement. With the Red Army, there is no effect on family. There's no difference. And actually, if you don't have family history with the Red Army, you're less likely to support a peace agreement too. And then finally, the Rosneft and Zhukov mechanism does have an effect, as in those people whose friends or family were killed are also no more likely to seek treatment or no more likely to support a peace agreement if they have family experience with Holodomor. That's a three-way interaction. It's kind of complicated to explain, but it is shown here. On the other hand, if you don't have family experience and your friends and family were killed with Holodomor, then you are less likely to support a peace agreement. Okay. Finally, why doesn't the Red Army treatment have an effect? The last question asked before the family treatment stuff was, who's to blame for the war? You're given 7 choices: Putin, the Russian government, the Russian people, the US, NATO, the Ukrainian government. Most people chose Putin. You can choose as many as you want. About 2/3 chose the Russian government. About 1/3 chose the Russian people. My apologies already for going over. But the clarification here is that respondents who got the Red Army treatment were more likely to blame the Russian government, more likely to blame the Russian people, less likely to blame Putin. And what I think this shows is that there's sort of this, yes, there is sort of this, we did collaborate, but you've kind of betrayed that memory by starting this war. And that's not just Putin that did it. It's not just one person. It's everybody that was involved. It's the Russian people. It's the Russian government. And I do think that kind of clarifies why hypothesis 3A didn't have an effect and why hypothesis 3 kind of was correct. So I'll wrap it up really quickly. Basically, what this is saying is historical frames and contemporary frames matter for peace agreements to sort of end an international invasion. We do care about this stuff, and collective memory of historical oppression does reduce support. At the same time, if there is popularity for joining this, oppressive side or invading side on the other side, it has a minor effect on increasing support for a peace agreement, but not much. Ultimately, at least last year, Zelensky said that a peace agreement needs to be approved by referendum. So this is something that matters in the broad scheme of things in the Ukrainian case. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case in reality, but he did say it, and maybe there is going to be a commitment to it. And broadly, there are some implications for maybe other conflicts if those conflicts take place. Hopefully not. But yeah, I'll wrap up there. Thank you guys, and look forward to Tolga's comments.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Konstantin, for a really interesting paper. I'll turn it over now to Tolga for discussion comments.
Great. Can you guys all hear me well? Mm-hmm. Perfect. So Konstantin, thank you so much. I mean, I very much enjoyed reading this paper. This is really very interesting, fascinating research. I mean, I like the paper because first, as you mentioned, there is research now, an increasing amount of research that actually looks at, the impact of history and historical events on current political outcomes, but you actually try to get at the collective memory of that history and how that actually influences attitudes in a very sort of significant, clearly very significant case, which I very much liked. I also liked how you sort of try to motivate the paper by saying that, eventually whatever agreement there is between Russia and Ukraine, Zelensky will put it to a referendum, so public opinion matters. And this is, a question that I believe, always struggle with public opinion research on conflict, like why should we care about public opinion? So I think you do a really good job there to explain why we should care about public opinion in this particular case of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I also liked a lot how you sort of differentiate the case of Ukraine and your research from rest of the research on public opinion in different conflict areas. So I think this is really a very sort of interesting and fascinating paper. So I have a bunch of comments, but I will try to sort of focus on sort of 5 of them. I think those are the ones that I believe are relatively more sort of important or major. So the first one is how we should interpret the treatment about the Ukrainian insurgent army and the UPA. And my concern there is that, so the goal is to sort of prime respondents about the collective memory of the Ukrainian insurgent army and how it fought against the Soviet Union forces. But then at the same time, you are saying rightfully in the paper that, there are different interpretations, positive and negative, of what this insurgent army did, including, how they also, collaborating with the Nazis and killing Poles and Jews and so on and so forth. So I care about this because I'm not entirely sure, therefore, if this particular vignette about the Ukrainian insurgent army primes the collective memory of that insurgent army, or is it basically priming nationalism or triggering nationalism amongst Ukrainians, just the way, for instance, listening to the Ukrainian national anthem would? And I'm particularly sort of concerned about this because if you also look at the outcomes that this treatment has an effect on are indeed the kinds of outcomes that triggered nationalist feelings would have an impact on, like disapproving making Russian second official language, disapproving giving independence to Donetsk and Luhansk regions. So that's one thing that I was sort of not entirely convinced about, whether this treatment actually primes the collective memory or whether it simply sort of triggers nationalistic attitudes or feelings amongst Ukrainian respondents. So that's one thing that I thought should be something that you should respond to in the paper. And I am also sort of curious about this because, so I would think that this collective history, the mechanism, the effect should go through personal experiences, at least to some extent. But so for majority of the results, as you also emphasize, the family history does not seem to matter much. So that again brings to me the question of, what exactly this treatment does, which clearly has some effects. So that's sort of the one first point that I want to make. The other one is, and the other two are more about sort of the methodology and methodology related issues. And one of those is, so at this point, I don't know what you can do about this, but so you have a lot of null findings and you do emphasize some of them, so that many of the interaction effects are not significant, or some of the treatments are also not significant. So is this really indeed null findings, or is this a matter of, maybe the study not being sufficiently powered? So I would like to see some discussion of the statistical power of this survey experiment. In other words, are these indeed null findings, or is it the case that you didn't have a sufficiently large number of sample, or you didn't have sufficiently high power that the effects weren't detected. And I worry about this because in some cases, right, so the point estimates are actually quite far from zero, but the confidence intervals are, and the standard errors are pretty wide. So that's another concern, and that I think you should somehow address. Even now, you can still sort of do a power analysis and see how strong the study is powered. The third thing is again related to sort of the method side of things, and that is you do really make a large number of comparisons, right? So, and then the question is, right, so how does this fact that you do multiple comparisons affect the results, right? So both when you focus on the results in table 3 and table 5, right? So almost everything is not significant, but there are one or two things that are significant, and you do focus on those. So, right, so I was wondering if they would still survive if you do some sort of correction for this multiple comparison issue by doing maybe like, Bonferroni correction or something along those lines. So I believe there should be some discussion of that as well in the paper. So these are sort of three sort of issues that to me sort of stood out. There are a couple sort of others which I think are relatively sort of less important, but I still want to emphasize those two, and then I have a bunch of more sort of minor points. One is, and this might be purely a matter of me having a different sort of intuition about your interpretation of that particular result, and that is this, and you did actually talk about it in the presentation also, and I was still not sure which way the sort of the intuition should go, and let me explain what I mean. So this is the results with who is to blame for the invasion, and you are so to me I would expect that a reminder about the Red Army and collective effort of the Ukrainians with the Russians, that would actually intuitively I would think that should make me more likely to blame Putin rather than the Russians in general, or the Russian government, or the Russian people, right? I would think that, wow, we had this past history of fighting together. It is this Putin who messed us up, right? So that's, to me, intuitively, again, so like you being in the field, to me, intuitively, that's how I would think the treatment should have worked. But you see the exact opposite, and somehow your interpretation is also, you think that somehow, right, so that treatment actually makes people more likely to blame the Russian government and the Russian people in general. But to me, again, intuitively, I would expect the exact opposite. So maybe, I don't know, if you can say a little bit more about why this is the case in the paper, I mean, that would help. And then the last thing, and then I think I should stop, and the minor points we can discuss afterwards, or I can just email them to you, is that, so I was a little bit confused the way you formulated the 1A, 2A, 3A hypotheses. And the reason is, so, I thought that they are about, right, heterogeneous treatment effects, and that's how you actually test them in the analyses. But then if you read the texts of those hypotheses, they do not talk about heterogeneous treatment effects. They talk about, the effect of having personal experience of, or having a family member in the Ukrainian insurgent army, having experienced the Holodomor, and so on and so forth. But they do not really talk about, the effect of the, Ukrainian insurgent army treatment will depend on whether a family member, whether a respondent has a family member in the Ukrainian insurgent army. So I didn't know why. Maybe it's just, maybe I don't understand it, but if the point is, right, to specify hypotheses about heterogeneous treatment effects, then I think they should be formulated as such. And I think I should stop here. I have a bunch of other comments, but they're relatively minor. If you have time, I am more than happy to get into those as well. But overall, again, I think this is really very important and interesting research, and I very much enjoyed reading it.
Thank you, Tolga. So, Konstantin, if you'd like to respond to any of those, or especially anything that you think would be, useful for y'all to continue the discussion, go ahead.
Sure thing. I'm back. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Tolga, so much. It's really good comments. I will take the power and Bonferroni correction into account. That's just methodsy stuff I can do. With the hypotheses, I think I just wrote them poorly in the pre-analysis plan, and I'm just kind of stuck with that writing. I guess I could just change them around, but yeah, the pre-analysis, that's how they were. I just copied and pasted from the pre-analysis plan the way it was written. And yeah, that was a pretty haphazard pre-analysis plan that was written like 3 days before the survey was launched. Not that this was stuff I was thinking. It was just like, needed to get done. With the who's to blame for the invasion, so I would say that this is definitely something that qualitatively was also evident to me. I think when I got to Lviv, I got there at like midnight, so there's at the time, I'm not sure if this is still going on, there was like a curfew, so I was just like, I'm stuck at the train station until 5. But then there was this guy who's like, hey, do you want to take a cab together? They're like doing like some cab share thing. And he was from Kharkiv. And he was talking about like, we're deleting numbers of Russian people from our phones. We don't talk to them. We like, yeah, we argued over some statues before, but that like the city is getting blown up like that. So that just qualitatively, there was another woman, the surveys I was monitoring, she was from Donbass and then moved to Odessa and then had to move to Lviv. And she was saying that her father lived in Rostov, which is in Russia. And she said that we haven't talked like since the war. That's it. And these stories are just, there's just 8. So there is evidence that this collective memory thing, there's just a complete shutdown of at least right now. And like my mom and aunt still talk to some people in Russia, like, and they're either don't mention the war or just say stuff that I don't want to repeat here. I'll say that. So there's definitely a large division here that's emerged, and just reminding people about like the World War II, it seems to remind them like, hey, these people suck. We don't want to be a part of it. But I think qualitatively that's kind of what I'll try to work that into the paper. It's kind of in a different paper. That's why I'm like, do I double up? But yeah. On the Ukrainian insurgent army treatment, yeah. So you are right to like, I can't say you're wrong. It's true. I framing it as the positive part does potentially make it this nationalist memory, but we do have to think about it. And then this is just an open question, like in the 2014, 2022, it's still a point of controversy of what the Ukrainian, even before, like when Yushchenko made Bandera a Ukrainian national hero in 2009, it was a huge uproar like against it. So there is sort of this, yes, on the western side of the country. And when I piloted a survey with somebody from Lviv, even before I got there, they had very nice things to say about their occupiers between 1941 and 1944, and not so nice things to say about their occupiers 1944 on. So there is this perception of, on that side, that yes, those are, and you can find the same thing if you go to Poland, things like that. But in terms of whether that translates to Dnipro, whether it translates to Kharkiv, whether it translates to any of the refugees, like I was really surprised that one guy who was a refugee, was in Lviv, was from Zaporizhia Oblast, Tokmak, which is still occupied. He was joining the Ukrainian army, and he was like, "Yeah, I wish my family was Ukrainian." Like, you would not expect to hear that from somebody, and that's very tangibly. And I don't think it's a tangible part of the collective Ukrainian consciousness before the invasion. So if it's become that, I think that is a different story. But yeah, I have to kind of think about that a little bit more. But yeah, yeah, those are my responses.
Okay, so it looks as if we are the only attendees at the moment. I think we had someone else and they left. So what that means is we have lots and lots of time for all of the more minor things that Tolga wanted to discuss. So Konstantin, I had only read your pre-analysis plan. So admittedly, these questions or anything that I have is outdated at this point. But I had a related question, I think, about the sort of the heterogeneous effects, but I think it was more along the lines of, I just wasn't sure why you were proposing a conditional effect based on sort of proximity to conflict in the first hypothesis, but not in the other hypotheses. So why the experience of having family members or having the personal experience of conflict might not also condition those other and again, this might be a very outdated question, so if you please feel free to say that that's no longer relevant. And then a second thing that I was curious about, and I am thinking a little bit about the Tellez article and the Colombian peace process. So this is obviously very different context, from which I'm approaching this. But just thinking about how having someone close to you being killed or injured or horribly involved in war can also provoke like active engagement, right? So it can lead to, we need this to stop. You have a higher perception of cost, but it can also certainly lead to, if the war is ongoing, even bypassing the, like, just do I support a militaristic end as much as, am I going to get involved? So I just wondered if there was any, I know this is a different context and the opportunities for involvement are likely not the same as, kind of popular participation in the Colombian conflict. But I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. And like I said, feel free to disregard either of those questions, but otherwise, after that, we can return to Tolga's more minor points and y'all can discuss those.
Thank you, Chelsea. Yeah, so on the first point, so it was literally a test of Rosenos and Zhukov. So they found that sort of the more there's a threat of repression on the Soviet side, and I think there was also something about the DNR, LNR in there as well, what I remember. The more likely people with that Holodomor history or from the regions that experienced Holodomor were likely to kind of boost their support of whatever dictatorial regime was in charge, whether it was DNR, LNR, or it was the Soviet Union at the time. In terms of, but yeah, it was a straightforward test of their hypothesis, and it seems to have worked. So kudos to them for carrying over and replicating in the current context. And so the other question in terms of, so there is another hypothesis about the effect of just the effect of sort of having family members or friends killed or in the occupation zones. That doesn't have a direct effect on the peace settlement or on the war thing. It's in, I think, table 4, but I didn't write up the hypothesis because I thought it was like, I'll just put it in some appendix later on. But yeah, in terms of participation, I'm trying to think of what the questions were. I don't think they were asked directly if they wanted to join the military or something like that, because the assumption was that if you're in the military, you're probably not going to be surveyed anyway. Even if you're just standing on the street, there's probably some law that says you can't come up with these people. But yeah, I'll have to think about it in terms of, I don't think they were asked anything like explicit participation. But that's the only participation is like joining in some capacity, because there's a pretty formal division between. There used to be, like, if you remember my paper from last year, did not used to be, but now there is a formal division between sort of the armed forces. There's a formal joining mechanism again, and everybody else. Thank you for comments. So
yeah, absolutely. I hope that this will not continue in the sense that you get to go and do more field work on this topic. But, you know, should you get to, I think exploring more about those dynamics with proximity and some of the other questions I think could be really interesting. Because that, to me, that has obviously important implications for this conflict, but also has some generalizable implications just in how we think about public opinion. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Tolga so that he can give you some of the other things he'd like to see happen for the paper.
Yeah, so just a few things. Again, these are minor, things that I sort of thought about while I was reading the paper. So one thing is, I would really like to see maybe it is in the appendix, but I didn't see the appendix, but I think that should be in the paper actually, like some descriptive statistics about, the characteristics of your respondents in the sample beyond, the ones that you have, not just the outcome variables, but, you do, for instance, say, which I am sure, right, and you also included it in the analysis, like what percentage of your respondents were internal migrants, internal refugees, and how it varies by region. You have a bunch of other questions, demographic questions, and also other questions, about nationalism and a couple of other identity questions I think you had in the survey. So I would really like to see just, the baseline values for those. I think it would be really helpful, which I couldn't see in the paper. The other, again, these are minor issues and so you do have the figures for the, family history of respondents for each sort of treatment, right? How many of them had family members who suffered from Holodomor. Then you do the same thing for Ukrainian insurgent army. You did ask these questions after the treatments, which I understand because, otherwise I think the questions themselves could work like primes. I believe that was the sort of your thinking, which I understand. But I was actually still curious how these percentages actually compare to the percentages in the control group. Because again, right, so the treatments themselves may have affected the responses that you got from your respondents about their family experiences of these things. So I would like to see in this table too, not just, again, if I understand correctly, these are only for the 3 treatment groups you present these percentages. So I would like to see how they also look like for the control group. I hope this makes sense. The other thing is that, again, there is nothing that you can do about this at this point, but I'm saying this basically, I think it would be good if you acknowledge this in the paper, right? That's my point. I'm not saying this, look, there's this issue and I want to just, put it out there. Ideally, right, in an ideal research design, because of question order effects, right? If I understand correctly, right? So you have asked these questions about possible deals, right? Possible concessions in the same order to everyone. Which might also have an effect on the answers that you got, right? At some point, maybe your respondents pay more attention to the first question, but less attention to the last question. So, in an ideal world, right? So in a world where we have more resources, right? Ideally, you would want to randomize the order of those questions as well. Again, it's not a big thing, but I think it would be good if you acknowledge that, this may have affected the answers that you got. So these are sort of, again, these were comments on the method side. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that this is just, again, a minor issue. There's one other paper that I think you should cite in the paper. It's not exactly on the topic that you are working on, but it's also based on a survey experiment in the Donbas region in Ukraine in 2018. It's this piece by Jonathan Lupe and Jeff Wallace. They did a survey experiment looking at how, priming respondents about whom military actors in the Donbas conflict, how different military actors in the Donbas conflict since 2014 target different types of targets, like civilian or military, affects views of those armed groups. It's published in JCR in just last year. I mean, I think it is pretty related to what you are doing, so I think you should also cite that piece. It just occurred to me as I was reading the piece. And so in relation to that, I also thought, I still think that you do a really good job of distinguishing the Ukraine case from others. And I do see your point in general that, so this is a relatively recent conflict compared to others, right? That's one point that you make. But then if you think about the conflict in the Donbas region, which was going on since 2014, right? So it is not exactly right that, this is, I mean, of course, the Russian invasion has added a whole new dimension to the conflict. But at the same time, I think it would be good if you acknowledge that at least in part of Ukraine, there has been an ongoing conflict for almost now 9 years or so, since 2014. I think these are the issues. And one last thing, so when I look at the interaction effect figures, right? So I thought the family history variables were binary. But those figures are such that as if they are continuous. So do you see what I'm saying? I thought the family history variables, like, a family member in Holodomor or not, a family member who was part of the Ukrainian insurgent army or not. I thought we would see just sort of two, sort of effect estimates. One for those who said that they had family members and one for those who said they did not. So I guess I misunderstood the variable, because you can have such interaction effects only if those variables are, I believe, continuous. So I think that's about it.
Great, thank you again. I'll start with the last one. So it's a 1 to 5, so it's like definitely no,
Okay.
definitely yes. But then people say maybe, they're like you're going to grandparents and stuff. So I mean,
so
like, yeah.
So it would be great if you label that x-axis.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, I was like last minuting those, and I was just
I
like, oh,
understand.
you know what? Instead of figuring out how to label them, I'm just going to get rid of the labels altogether. Not do it at all. But yeah, I will get those labels. In terms of, thank you for the open wall citation. Definitely more citations the better. Especially since I think the citation page compared to other stuff I've written is not so big. In terms of, yeah, no, the ordering effects, it kind of had to be that way because I didn't think the territorial stuff had to be in that specific place. And the last questions needed to have all the treatments. And so it's kind of, it's a weird structure, but then I'm like, well, I can't ask the territorial question about the oblast after I asked the other one. So it kind of like, I acknowledged I could have shuffled around the three, the neutralities, second language, NATO ones. That's true. But yeah, everything else kind of like had to be in like specific order, just based on the way the treatments were distributed, and that's to some extent my bad. But that I didn't shuffle them around. But yeah, I acknowledge that could be an issue. Okay, yeah, and the appendix in theory exists. It's only in my head right now. In the future, it will not be in my head. But I have done comparisons for other papers, including the JCR RNR paper I mentioned earlier, with this stuff, and because there's pre-treatment questions that were used on that paper. And a 2019 survey in terms of comparing how the responses change, what the demographics are. So that's going to go in there, and I'll definitely include the descriptive statistics. And there is a hypothesis on nationalism, That's also probably going to be an appendix to be tested because it's about how family history of living in a non-Soviet country between 1922 and 1939 affects nationalism, which was kind of my original project before the invasion happened, and it ended up being very peripheral. And I honestly haven't tested it yet, but there aren't a lot of people, because this was a different sample, there aren't a lot of people who had that family history necessarily, especially like broken down into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and other situations. And yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you again, Tolga. Those are great comments, and Chelsea as well.
Okay, well, I think we are reaching a conclusion here. So again, I'll ask if there's any last minute comments or questions that either of you would like to add. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so huge thanks, Konstantin, for the paper. This is a really cool read, and I think it's going to be a fantastic final project, or final product, that is, and obviously incredibly salient. So I hope that you'll get lots of readership on this. And Tolga, thank you for those wonderful comments. I know that they will advance the paper and help with its eventual publication. So let me just wrap up here. So this will become available on the OPSC website and then also on our YouTube page. So if you are watching this after the fact, if you missed the presentation today, please feel free to comment on the YouTube page, or you can email the author of this paper. So if you have feedback, if you're watching this after the fact, don't hesitate to make sure that we see that. So I will conclude there. And once again, just thank all of you for participating, and hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks.
Thank you.